Biblical Hebrew, also called Classical Hebrew, is the archaic form of the Hebrew language. The term Hebrew was not used for the language in the Bible, which referred to Canaanite or Judahite, but the name was used in Greek and Mishnah Hebrew texts. Biblical Hebrew is attested from about the 10th century BCE, and persisted through and beyond the Jewish Second Temple period. Biblical Hebrew eventually developed into Mishnah Hebrew, which was spoken until the 2nd century CE. Biblical Hebrew is best attested in the Hebrew Bible, the collection of Judaic religious and historical texts which reflect various stages of the Hebrew language in its consonantal skeleton, as well as a vocalic system which was added later, in the Middle Ages by the Masortes. There is also some evidence of regional dialectal variation, including differences between Biblical Hebrew as spoken in the northern kingdom of Israel and in the southern kingdom of Judah. Biblical Hebrew has been written with a number of different writing systems. The Hebrews adopted the Phoenician script around the 12th century BCE, which developed into the Paleo-Hebrew script. This was retained by the Samaritans, who use the descendant Samaritan script to this day. However, the Aramaic script gradually displaced the Paleo-Hebrew script for the Jews, and it became the source for the modern Hebrew alphabet. All of these scripts were lacking letters to represent all of the sounds of Biblical Hebrew. Though these sounds are reflected in Greek and Latin translations of the time, these scripts originally only indicated consonants, but certain letters, known as matralexionais, became increasingly used to mark vowels. In the Middle Ages, various systems of diacritics were developed to mark the vowels in Hebrew manuscripts. Of these, only the Tiberian system is still in wide use. Biblical Hebrew possessed a series of emphatic consonants whose precise articulation is disputed, likely adjective or pharyngealized. Earlier Biblical Hebrew possessed 3 consonants which did not have their own letters in the writing system, but over time they merged with other consonants. The stop consonants developed fricative allophones under the influence of Aramaic, and these sounds eventually became marginally phonemic. The pharyngeal and glottal phonemes underwent weakening in some regional dialects, as reflected in the modern Samaritan Hebrew reading tradition. The vowel system of Biblical Hebrew changed dramatically over time and is reflected differently in the ancient Greek and Latin transcriptions, medieval vocalization systems, and modern reading traditions. Biblical Hebrew had a typical Semitic morphology, placing triconsonantal roots into patterns to form words. Biblical Hebrew distinguished 2 genders, 3 numbers. Verbs were marked for voice and mood, and had 2 conjugations which may have indicated aspect or tense. The tense or aspect of verbs was also influenced by the conjugation, in the so-called WAW consecutive construction. Default word order was verb subject object, and verbs inflected for the number, gender, and person of their subject. Pronominal suffixes could be appended to verbs or nouns, and nouns had special construct forms for use in possessive constructions. Nomenclature. The earliest written sources refer to Biblical Hebrew by the name of the land in which it was spoken, the language of Canaan. The Hebrew Bible also shows that the language was called Judean, Judahite. In the Hellenistic period, Greek writings use the names Hebraios, Hebraista, and in Mishnah Hebrew we find Hebrew and Hebrew language. The origin of this term is obscure. Suggested origins include the biblical Eber, the ethnonyms Abiru, Apiru, and Apiru found in sources from Egypt and the Near East, and a derivation from the root to pass alluding to crossing over the Jordan River. Jews also began referring to Hebrew as the Holy Tongue in Mishnah Hebrew. The term Classical Hebrew may include all pre-medieval dialects of Hebrew, including Mishnah Hebrew, or it may be limited to Hebrew contemporaneous with the Hebrew Bible. The term Biblical Hebrew refers to pre-Mishnah dialects. The term Biblical Hebrew may or may not include extra-biblical texts, such as inscriptions. and generally also includes later vocalization traditions for the Hebrew Bible's consonantal text, most commonly the early medieval Tiberians vocalization. History. The archaeological record for the prehistory of Biblical Hebrew is far more complete than the record of Biblical Hebrew itself. Early Northwest Semitic materials are attested from 2350 BCE to 1200 BCE, the end of the Bronze Age. The Northwest Semitic languages, including Hebrew, differentiated noticeably during the Iron Age. Although in its earliest stages Biblical Hebrew was not highly differentiated from Ugaritic and Amarna-Canaanite, Hebrew developed during the latter half of the 2nd millennium BCE between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, an area known as Canaan. The Israelite tribes established a kingdom in Canaan at the beginning of the 1st millennium BCE, which later split into the Kingdom of Israel in the north and the Kingdom of Judah in the south after a dispute of succession. The earliest Hebrew writing yet discovered was found at Khirbet Qafar and dates to the 10th century BCE. The Kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. The Kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, its higher classes exiled and the First Temple destroyed. Later the Persians made Judah a province and permitted Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple. According to the Gemara, Hebrew of this period was similar to Imperial Aramaic, in Pesahim, Tractate 87b. Hanuna bar Hammer said that God sent the exiled Jews to Babylon because the Babylonian language is akin to the Lesson-to HaKodesh. Aramaic became the common language in the north, in Galilee and Samaria. Hebrew remained in use in Judah, however the returning exiles brought back Aramaic influence, and Aramaic was used for communicating with other ethnic groups during the Persian period. Alexander conquered Judah in 332 BCE, beginning the period of Hellenistic domination. During the Hellenistic period Judea became independent under the Hasmoneans, but later the Romans ended their independence, making Herod the Great their governor. One Jewish revolt against the Romans led to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and the Second Bar Kokhba revolt in 132-135 CE led to a large departure of the Jewish population of Judea. Biblical Hebrew after the Second Temple period evolved into Missionary Hebrew, which ceased being spoken and developed into a literary language around 200 CE. Hebrew continued to be used as a literary and liturgical language in the form of medieval Hebrew, and Hebrew began a revival process in the 19th century, culminating in modern Hebrew becoming the official language of the State of Israel. Currently, Classical Hebrew is generally taught in public schools in Israel, and Biblical Hebrew forms are sometimes used in modern Hebrew literature, much as archaic and biblical constructions are used in modern English literature. Since modern Hebrew contains many biblical elements, Biblical Hebrew is fairly intelligible to modern Hebrew speakers. The primary source of Biblical Hebrew material is the Hebrew Bible. Epigraphic materials from the area of Israelite territory are written in a form of Hebrew called inscriptional Hebrew, although this is meagerly attested. According to Walker and O'Connor, inscriptional Hebrew is not strikingly different from the Hebrew preserved in the Masoretic text. The damp climate of Israel caused the rapid deterioration of papyrus and parchment documents, in contrast to the dry environment of Egypt, and the survival of the Hebrew Bible may be attributed to scribal determination in preserving the text through copying. No manuscript of the Hebrew Bible dates to before 400 BCE, although two silver rolls from the 7th or 6th century BCE show a version of the priestly blessing. Vowel and cantillation marks were added to the older consonantal layer of the Bible between 600 CE and the beginning of the 10th century. The scholars who preserved the pronunciation of the Bibles were known as the Masortes. The most well-preserved system that was developed, and the only one still in religious use, is the Tiberians' vocalization. but both Babylonian and Palestinian vocalizations are also attested. The Palestinian system was preserved mainly in Piyutim, which contain biblical quotations. Classification. Biblical Hebrew is a Northwest Semitic language of the Canaanite subgroup. As a Northwest Semitic language, Hebrew shows the shift of initial asterisk, with 2j, a similar independent pronoun system to the other Northwest Semitic languages. Some archaic forms, such as nanu, we, first-person singular pronominal suffix I or ya, and n, commonly preceding pronominal suffixes. Case endings are found in Northwest Semitic languages in the 2nd millennium BCE, but disappear almost totally afterwards. Mimation is absent in singular nouns, but is often retained in the plural, as in Hebrew. The Northwest Semitic languages formed a dialect continuum in the Iron Age, with Phoenician and Aramaic on each extreme. Hebrew is classed with Phoenician in the Canaanite subgroup, which also includes Ammonite, Edomite, and Moabite. Moabite might be considered a Hebrew dialect, though it possessed distinctive Aramaic features. Although Ugaritic shows a large degree of affinity to Hebrew in poetic structure, vocabulary, and some grammar, it lacks some Canaanite features, and its similarities are more likely a result of either contact or preserved archaism. Hebrew underwent the Canaanite vowel shift, where Proto-Semitic tended to shift to o, perhaps when stressed. Hebrew also shares with the Canaanite languages the shifts *th greater than z, theta, and *l greater than per second, widespread reduction of diphthongs, and full assimilation of non-final n to the following consonant if word final, i.e., bat, from *bant. There is also evidence of an rule of assimilation of y to the following coronal consonant in pre-tonic position, shared by Hebrew, Phoenician and Aramaic. Typical Canaanite words in Hebrew include roof, table, window, old, expel. Morphological Canaanite features in Hebrew include the masculine plural marker, first-person singular pronoun, interrogative pronoun, definite article, and third-person plural feminine verbal marker. As Biblical Hebrew evolved from Proto-Semitic, it underwent a number of consonantal merges, parallel with those in other Canaanite languages. There is no evidence that these mergers occurred after the adaptation of the Hebrew alphabet. Eras. Biblical Hebrew as preserved in the Hebrew Bible is composed of multiple linguistic layers. The consonantal skeleton of the text is the most ancient, while the vocalization and cantillation are later additions reflecting a later stage of the language. These additions were added after 600 CE. Hebrew had already ceased being used as a spoken language around 200 CE. Biblical Hebrew is reflected in the consonantal text of the Bible, and in extra-biblical inscriptions may be subdivided by era. The oldest form of Biblical Hebrew, Archaic Hebrew, is found in poetic sections of the Bible and inscriptions dating to around 1000 BCE, the early monarchic period. This stage is also known as Old Hebrew or Paleo-Hebrew, and is the oldest stratum of Biblical Hebrew. The oldest known artifacts of Archaic Biblical Hebrew are various sections of the Tanakh, including the Song of Moses and the Song of Deborah. Biblical poetry uses a number of distinct lexical items, for example for prose, see for great. Some have cognates in other Northwest Semitic languages, for example, dew and gold, which are common in Canaanite and Ugaritic. Grammatical differences include the use of and as relative particles, negative, and various differences in verbal and pronominal morphology and syntax. Later pre-exilic Biblical Hebrew is known as Biblical Hebrew proper, or Standard Biblical Hebrew. This is dated to the period from the 8th to the 6th century BCE. In contrast to Archaic Hebrew, Standard Biblical Hebrew is more consistent in using the definite article, the accusative marker, distinguishing between simple and waw consecutive verb forms, and in using particles like an rather than as in Deaton. Biblical Hebrew from after the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE is known as Late Biblical Hebrew. Late Biblical Hebrew shows Aramaic influence in phonology, morphology, and lexicon, and this trend is also evident in the later developed Tiberians vocalization system. Qumran Hebrew, attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls from California, 200 BCE to 70 CE, is a continuation of Late Biblical Hebrew. Qumran Hebrew may be considered an intermediate stage between Biblical Hebrew and Mishnah Hebrew, though Qumran Hebrew shows its own idiosyncratic dialectal features. Dialect variation in Biblical Hebrew is attested to by the well-known Shibboleth incident of Judges chapter 12 verse 6. Where Jephthah's forces from Gilead caught Ephraimites trying to cross the Jordan River by making them say the Ephraimites' identity was given away by their pronunciation. The apparent conclusion is that the Ephraimite dialect had per second for standard. As an alternative explanation, it has been suggested that the Proto-Semitic phoneme theta, which shifted to in most dialects of Hebrew, may have been retained in the Hebrew of the Transjordan. However, there is evidence that the word had initial consonant * in Proto-Semitic, contradicting this theory. Hebrew as spoken in the northern kingdom of Israel, known also as Israelian Hebrew, shows phonological, lexical, and grammatical differences from southern dialects. The northern dialect spoken around Samaria shows more frequent simplification of aj into e, as attested by the Samaria ostraca, e.g., while the southern dialect instead adds in an epenthetic vowel, I, added halfway through the first millennium BCE. The wordplay in Amos chapter 8 verses 1-2 may reflect this. Given that Amos was addressing the population of the northern kingdom, the vocalization * would be more forceful. Other possible northern features include use of who, that, forms like to know, rather than in infinitives of certain verbs of the form to do, rather than. The Samaria ostraca also show for standard year, as in Aramaic. The guttural phonemes hh merged over time in some dialects. This was found in Dead Sea Scroll Hebrew, but Jerome attested to the existence of contemporaneous Hebrew speakers who still distinguished pharyngeals. Samaritan Hebrew also shows a general attrition of these phonemes, though h are occasionally preserved as